Adventure Time is back after a 2-year hiatus, continuing the story of the show by detailing events after both the original series and HBO's Distant Lands. This time, we're focusing on the gender-bent pastiche of Finn and Jake, as well as the tragic character of Simon Petrikov, who, after not appearing for 2 years, returned, lonely and depressed. I've been watching Adventure Time continuously since it first started airing in 2010, and it holds a very dear place in my heart. One thing that always stood out to me that I feel like was never discussed as much as it should have been was the music of the show. Now, of course, the songs of the show, like the Fry's song, I Remember You, Everything Stays, and Time Adventure, are iconic, and have been discussed many, many times over the past decade. We'll talk about those songs in a sec, but what I first want to talk about is the underscore of the show, the instrumental tracks that play in the background during the majority of the show's runtime. Now, before we discuss the score, first we should talk about the composers of the show, Casey James Basichis and Tim Kiefer. First, Casey. Alright, never mind. Well, Tim, otherwise known as Stay Puft, has a much larger online presence, so it's easier to talk about his previous works and style. Tim still releases music to this day, and his music sounds like this. A pretty unique, experimental electronic sound. And if you're at all familiar with the score of the series, most of it sounds exactly like this. I want to talk about elements of this score relative to other scores from similar media, for the sake of comparison. So first, let's also listen to something tonally similar from a similar-ish show, Steven Universe. This is the character theme for Peridot, a tiny little goblin from space. And here's an excerpt from the score to the Adventure Time episode Hitman, where Ice King accidentally hires a hitman from the dark web to kill Finn and Jake. Now, before I draw any connections, I do understand that it's hard to make any sweeping generalizations about a show's score by simply comparing one excerpt from it to another from a different show. I've listened thoroughly to both scores, both while watching the shows and after the fact doing research for this video, and I factor that into my analysis. But don't just take my word for it, go listen to the scores of these shows, because, well, they're both great. But anyways, let's analyze the similarities first. Both of these tracks create an appropriate atmosphere for their respective situations and characters within them. Both scores utilize almost exclusively electronic instruments in their composition. Both scores lack a clear melody, and honestly that's where most of the similarities end. Steven Universe's score follows many conventions of modern animation scoring. It's mostly tonal, with recognizable chords, a clear chord progression, a cohesive and consistent set of instruments, and a groove that is intuitive to follow. This is also a character theme and features a recurring motif. Almost all of Adventure Time's underscore lacks these conventions. Looking at slipping pieces, we're not in any kind of key center, even though this tune mostly adheres to the G Mixolydian flat 6 scale, which sounds like this. The harmony is too simple, and the stand-in for the melody is too angular and jumpy to really anchor the listener in that kind of tonality. The groove is also a bit hard to follow. Even though it feels like a 4/4 kind of vibe for most of it, it's fairly minimal, and a lot of the melodic hits are on beats that aren't the downbeat. Many of the rhythmic accents follow this polyrhythmic, dotted eighth against the quarter note feel, like this bloop instrument and the bass. And the heavily syncopated lead synths were very hard to transcribe because it likely doesn't adhere to any grid or discernible subdivisions of the beat. All of these components serve to make it hard to overtly feel the downbeat and 4/4 nature of the groove unless you're really paying attention. And even though there is a groove, it's written in such a way where it feels more like a soundscape than a track. But what I find most interesting, and is the most consistent mainstay of the entire score, is its uniquely wide array of instruments. Though there are exceptions, of course, per general conventions of scoring, one would want to have a consistent palette, so to speak, of instruments within a piece of media. Most times, the set and style of instruments is determined by the setting. Something like Avatar: The Last Airbender appropriately features almost entirely Asian instruments as a one-to-one representation of its setting. A show like Succession, for instance, creates a more abstract representation by combining classical music with hip-hop, mirroring the elegance yet grittiness of the main character's business. Adventure Time lacks any consistent palette. In one scene within an episode, there will be some bloopy synths and vocal chops, but in another within the same episode we'll hear xylophones and a wonky track beat. Compare Slipping Pieces with the track from the very next episode. It's hard to really capture the sheer diversity of this show's score with just these two tracks. Sometimes we hear orchestral tracks with heavy reverb. Other times we hear ironic drum and bass tracks with thick 808s. One final convention of modern semi-serialized animation that Adventure Time lacks is musical leitmotifs that are introduced and developed. Steven Universe, for instance, might be an extreme example, with literally every single character in the main cast receiving both a theme and associated instrument. But even other shows with a semi-overarching plot, like Gravity Falls, introduces themes for their characters that reoccur and get remixed and arranged, including the themes for Mabel, Gideon, and this triangle dude. But Adventure Time, as far as I'm aware, has exactly 0 recurring musical themes or motifs, which I find super interesting as an artistic decision, especially for a show with dozens of iconic songs performed by main characters. So why is it like this? Why is a show with such a dense world and recurring cast of iconic characters so lacking in musical thematic consistency? I don't think either of the show's composers have ever made a statement about it, and of course there's always a possibility that it's just what they like to write, but I personally think it's a very deliberate decision. The Land of Ooo is a cobbled-together dreamscape of wacky characters and disparate settings. It's the very essence of what makes the show's world as unique as it is, where allusions to a long-forgotten nuclear war are juxtaposed next to this dude.
Turn and push.
Oh my god! Oh jeez, oh my god!
The Adventure Time score is so seemingly random by necessity. It's the auditory representation of our world put in a blender with post-apocalyptic themes and D&D tropes. The lack of overt themes and recurring motifs keeps the score from sounding like it's written by a person in the real world, instead almost as if the music is coming from the world itself. And oftentimes, it does. So this is a wonderful segue to discuss the songs of Adventure Time. According to the wiki, there are 155 songs that appear in the show, if we're not counting Man Lorette Party because it's entirely instrumental, and Brocco Don't Go because it's only used in the credits. Let's talk diegesis. Something in a piece of media that is diegetic exists within the world and the scene. It is heard or seen by the characters on screen. Diegetic music could include a ringtone, music from a jukebox, or something sung or played by a character in the scene. Non-diegetic music includes the underscore, the background music for a scene that is meant only for the audience to hear. In Adventure Time, of the 155 songs in the show, only 4 of them are not strictly diegetic. One of them is what I would call semi-diegetic. In the house hunting song, series creator Pendleton Ward sings a little tune about Finn and Jake finding a new house after Marceline evicts them. Though it starts non-diegetic, he addresses Marceline and she replies in the song, kind of adding a sort of meta-diegesis to it. The other 3, Cave Song, Billy, and Ice Cream Marathon, are sung by showrunners, and the characters do not perceive or otherwise interact with the music. Probably just because of the stylistic shifts in the show, the only 4 non-diegetic songs in the entire soundtrack take place within the first 2 seasons, and all other of the 151 tunes are diegetic. Even if they're short or not necessarily tonal, they're always sung, performed, or otherwise listened to by the characters on screen. I think it's also important to say that the show doesn't treat the songs like a musical, where the performances are of both dubious diegesis and canonicity. There are multiple episodes where central plot points are resolved with the music itself, and not just the music as a metaphor for plot development. Characters often remember prior songs, and many are referenced after their first appearance. Additionally, a lot of the time, the entire, or at least most of the instrumentation of the song appears on screen, rather than characters singing over a non-diegetic instrumental track. Marceline will often sing something over solo bass, Beemo will provide chiptune beeps and boops, or characters will simply sing over another character badly beatboxing. This is such a cool stylistic choice by the writers and composers of the show. In a world where so many things are wacky and unfamiliar distortions of sci-fi and fantasy tropes, having characters play simple, intimate songs that are performed off the cuff makes the audience resonate with, ironically, how human every character is. And not just Finn, of course. The performances feel like they were captured on the first take, in the moment. Instruments are played with sloppy timing and don't line up with the vocals. Oftentimes, it's obvious a song is in a difficult key for the voice actors to sing. Listen to how low Tom Kenny has to sing in Remember You.
Away. I can't remember what it made me say.
or how this high G is slightly too high for John DiMaggio to sing confidently in his Jake voice.
Go on a date, cause it feels like there's a fire inside my body, like there's a fire inside my heart. It's like this fire is gonna
But they never bothered changing the key, making the voice actor get a so-called perfect take, or using pitch correction. Even the theme song is an example of this. Also sung by Pendleton Ward, this recording of the theme song on a low-quality mic was meant to be just a demo, but they decided they liked the performance of it so much that they kept it. You can even hear producer Derek Dryman typing in the background during one small section of the intro. From scratch recordings to out-of-tune melodies, all of these decisions serve to make the show uniquely immersive. After all, in universe, most of these characters aren't trained musicians. Every song they sing should sound exactly like My Vietnamese Family when they get together for karaoke. But we've really only talked about the performance. Let's take a look at the writing. We'll start with a snippet of Everything Stays.
When you turn it around, everything stays right where you left it. Everything stays, but it still changes ever so slightly, daily and nightly, in little ways when everything stays.
Even people who don't watch Adventure Time are familiar with the brilliance of its songs, and this is no accident. The majority of the most recognizable tunes in the show were written by Rebecca Sugar, who wrote almost all of the songs in Steven Universe. I could make an entire video about that soundtrack as well, but all that is to say, she is a great songwriter, using efficient and simple melodies with relatively simple chords to make such catchy tunes. Looking at Everything Stays, it's pretty tonal, especially compared to the earlier instrumental tracks. We're squarely in G major / E minor, with 2 melody notes and a few chords barely dipping out of the key. And the thing is, especially in later seasons, all of the songs are like this, very intimate, catchy, and singable, serving as a stark contrast to the bizarre and frenetic instrumental tracks. This so effectively paints the image of human-like inhabitants inside of a wacky and ironic post-apocalyptic landscape. So how did the sequel series, Fionna and Cake, adhere to these conventions? So this show, despite being more or less a sequel series to Adventure Time and the HBO specials, does something completely different with its music. Tim Kiefer left the series, and replacing him is Amanda Jones, who previously did work on A Bit of Distant Lands. The tonal shift is immediately apparent. Let's listen to the opening theme. This is the first proper opening for Adventure Time without vocals, and it's also the first that isn't an arrangement of the original theme. Despite being instrumental, it doesn't have the jittery, hard-to-follow feel of the old Tim Kiefer instrumental tracks, but it's also still super weird, and tonally, something that hasn't been heard before in Adventure Time. First off, we're in a really uncommon tonality, if you can even call it that. All of the notes outline the C-sharp half-whole diminished scale, which sounds like this. We've previously talked about the whole half-diminished scale being used in the Owl House opening, but the half-whole diminished scale is way less common, especially as a melody. There may be a deeper symbolic reason for its usage here, but honestly, I think it's used here because it fits the higher stakes, chaotic, off-kilter tone of this new series. Breaking another huge convention of the series, we have musical foreshadowing and leitmotif. In this opening, there is a subtle sleigh bell in the background, alluding to the Ice King and Simon's role in the series. But they also do something really cool with the first song in the show. Let's take a listen to the first few seconds.
I'm not really feeling like myself today.
This motif is slightly altered and used later in the episode, mysteriously, when Cake hears it while longingly looking out the window towards an ice rink. And the payoff for the motif happens much later, when Simon reveals that the melody belongs to a song that he and his lost love Betty used to listen to.
Ooh, and I love you, no, it's not so hard to tell. And I love you.
As far as I'm aware, this is the first instance in Adventure Time where a leitmotif was developed, but what I find super neat is that it wasn't used arbitrarily. It still has an in-universe explanation. Since this first part of the show takes place in Simon's head, the characters within heard a distorted version of the song that he knows. This even explains the apparent lack of diegesis for Not Myself, and this even almost explains why the underscore is more subdued and expected compared to the original series. The first part of the show ostensibly takes place in a normal human world. The usual score of ooh wouldn't make sense here. I say almost explains because this style of scoring remains the same throughout the series, but it sounds great, so let's ignore that for now. On the topic of diegesis, the show also takes liberties previously unseen. Even outside of Simon's head, there is just a straight-up song that plays while he's walking and being sad. I don't even think he's thinking about it. It's entirely intended for just the audience to hear.
Does somebody jump for joy? Does somebody cry? Now that I'm not part of that sadness, does somebody want...
This song is super cool, with the chromatically descending dominant chords, just some classic Rebecca Sugar chord writing. But even still, it's not diegetic. We can also look at the song Winter King sings to Simon. Previously, we talked about the semi-diegesis of musical theater-style songs, and this is the very first of its kind in Adventure Time.
See the soft snowflakes swirl in my winter wonderworld.
Some parts of this are definitely not actually happening in-universe. None of the instruments are being played in the scene, and even if at least the singing is diegetic, this scene is of questionable canonicity.
Kiss each other!
Don't think it hasn't occurred to me.
Never mind, this is completely canon. But anyways, I suppose all of this is just a long-winded way of demonstrating the difference in scoring philosophy of this show compared to the original series. But why is it so different? It could simply be just because Tim Kiefer is gone and Amanda Jones writes a different style of music. I don't think that's the case though. This show takes a very different approach to the world of Adventure Time. Most of the show doesn't even take place in the land of Ooo we've come to know and love over the past 13 years. The main characters aren't Finn and Jake this time, and the tone of the show has aged with its audience. Overall, despite its differences compared to the original series, I think it's fitting of the meta-narrative style the series has evolved into. Amanda Jones created a great score for this world of Fionna and Cake, and it'll be interesting to see how future works in the Adventure Time multiverse either pay homage to the original scoring style or continue down this new one.
Making pancakes, making pancakes. Take some bacon and I'll put it in a pancake. Making pancakes, that's what it's gonna make. Bacon pancake. Making pancakes, making pancakes. Take some bacon and I'll put it in a pancake. Making pancakes, that's what it's gonna make. Bacon pancake.